The story of the Norton Manufacturing Company and its early ventures into the motorcycle industry begins with James Lansdowne Norton, a man of the Victorian age who truly was years ahead of his time. It's a fascinating tale of experiment and innovation, and as we cruise through a potted history of the company that he founded, while enjoying a range of classic examples of the best-loved Norton motorcycles, you'll have the opportunity to take a nostalgic ride down memory lane as the engines roar. So, throw your leg over the saddle, zip up your leather jacket, put on your goggles, do up your helmet, grab hold of the throttle, and let's kickstart this documentary into life. James Lansdowne Norton was born in Birmingham, the son of a cabinet maker. Having evidently inherited his father's manual dexterity, young James started his career as an apprentice toolmaker, before deciding to set up his own company in 1898. This was primarily to supply fittings for the burgeoning bicycle trade and its mutant infant offspring, the motorised bicycle, aka the motorcycle. The invention of the bicycle was one of the most significant developments in the 19th century because it made transport accessible to the whole population. Up until the bicycle's arrival in the 1860s, only the wealthy upper classes could afford to travel at will. But when pedal power liberated the common man, the entire fabric of society changed. Educational, work and social opportunities opened up as people could get from place to place, and a whole new travel for pleasure ethic evolved. However, it wasn't long before those with curious minds started to work out ways to make the humble bicycle go faster, and very quickly, machines started to materialise that were bicycles with engines attached. In the Midlands area, and Birmingham in particular, industry was thriving, and many of the great British motorcycle manufacturers began here with these motorised contraptions. BSA, Ariel, Triumph, and AJS all started alongside Norton as a new craze swept the land. The first Norton motorcycle was built in 1902 after a chance meeting with an importer of engines from France. This hybrid of a strengthened bicycle frame and a bolted-on 160cc Clement engine with a 2-speed gearbox was such a success that by 1907 the Norton brand was already becoming a household name. It was in this year that Rembrandt Fowler won the very first Isle of Man TT race on a Norton bike, with a 696cc Peugeot V-twin engine. The Norton motorcycle was also very popular with the ladies. As early as 1903, Norton began manufacturing motorcycles for the fairer sex, and this allowed some newfound freedom for females who would otherwise be tied to the home. The simple fact that they could ride these machines as well as their fathers, brothers and husbands was a big step in the right direction, laying the foundations for greater freedom in the 20th century. Norton motorcycles were renowned for being finely engineered right from the start, and had something of an exclusive reputation. If you'd wanted to buy a Norton in 1909, you might well have gone to Harrods to get one, as this grand establishment was the Birmingham Company's London agent. Motorcycling was soon a very popular pastime, and the constant desire to go faster and faster developed into the new sport of motor racing. The race circuits of Brooklands, Donington and the Isle of Man TT catered for those with a need for speed. Brooklands, for example, was a specially built oval-shaped motor racing circuit. It was specifically designed so that the track could be used as a testing ground for all makes of motorcycles and all types of vehicles, be it on 2 wheels or 4. Still in use today, nestled in the heart of the Surrey countryside, Brooklands became a veritable home from home for the Norton Company, where the early racers achieved great success. James Lansdowne Norton, the founder of the company, was riding in competition until 1911 and concentrating on developing his machines still further. However, designing and producing was a costly business, and Norton soon got into financial difficulty. He was bought out by a man named R.T. Shelley, who kindly retained Norton as joint managing director, even though he had no obligation to do so. The company was rechristened Norton Motors Limited. It was from then on that Norton became a force to be reckoned with, as a significant contributor to the British motorcycle industry, and indeed the global market. A government contract was secured in World War I for supplying machines to the Russian army, and in 1916 a move to larger premises in Bracebridge Street, Aston, Birmingham took Norton to the very heart of the industrial Midlands. The famous curly Norton logo appeared around this time, which would become such an iconic badge for emerging riders then and classic riders now. World War I halted production and development of the motorcycle in Britain, as factories were turned over to the manufacture of armaments for the war effort. Norton fared well, achieving military contracts, as did BSA, Triumph and Ariel. But those manufacturers who failed to secure such work eventually suffered as a result. Rex was as big a motorcycle company as Triumph up until the 1930s, universally known as the king of motorcycles. However, a lack of World War I military contracts left them struggling through the 1920s, and when the Wall Street crash set off a worldwide depression, they had no reserves to fall back on, and by 1933, Rex was no more. Many early British motorcycle manufacturers fell by the wayside with this chain of events, but those who survived prospered, as you'll see as we return to the Norton story. The motorbike you can see here is the 16H, a model that would undoubtedly have been ridden by James Lansdowne Norton at some stage during his short racing career. This was the second Norton ever built, after the Big 4, which was James Norton's favourite motorbike, and used many of the same design principles. The main difference between the two machines was the fact that the 16H used a smaller engine, but with the same 79mm x 100mm dimensions. The 490cc single-cylinder side-valve 4-stroke engine managed a top speed of around 80 miles per hour. The 16H frame was redesigned to have a lower ground clearance than the Big 4, and this became known as the Home model for travelling around England, and this is what the H in its name derived from. Later on, because of James Lansdowne Norton's travels around South Africa, he observed how the roads were different in the outer reaches of the British Empire. So, the 16H models that were shipped overseas were given a higher ground clearance, and they came to be known as the Colonial Nortons. In the Gentleman's Journal of 1911, the press release for this classic motorcycle makes for interesting reading. The most wonderful point about the Norton machine is its graceful and almost fragile appearance. It looks the beau ideal of elegance. In fact, it suggests effeminacy. You find yourself wondering where its marvellous strength and power comes from. It is so scientifically designed that the art of its construction conceals its Herculean capabilities. It must have taken years of study to perfect such a purveyor of power. It may be driven at a walking pace or at 50 miles per hour, or if a greater speed is desired, a 12 horsepower engine will carry you along at 80 miles per hour with perfect comfort, if your respiratory organs will stand it. If our respiratory organs are still intact, we can continue looking at this 1929 16H model with its side valve 490cc single engine and 3-speed gearbox. The 16H was a very versatile machine in its time, experiencing the speed of racing circuits, withstanding the danger of wartime action, and relaxing into the leisurely pursuit of a slow ride in the country. The 16H would continue being produced for a long time to come, but James Lansdowne Norton was always looking for the next upgrade, the next design, and the next challenge for the production team. Before long, there was a Model 18 to run aside the 16H, and although as yet the naming of the motorcycle seemed to be a fairly unimaginative business, the new motorcycle itself was anything but. The Model 18 would, in point of fact, run for Norton, with the ignition starting the engine rolling off the production line in 1922, as the horrors of the First World War had begun to subside. It would prove to be a very lengthy journey indeed, because the Norton 18's engine was not switched off until 32 years later. Fortunately, nobody asked how much petrol it had used by then. The Norton motorcycles were all belt-driven in their pre-World War I days. In an era when motorbikes outnumbered cars, these side-valve 3-speed machines like the Big 4 and the Brooklyn Special were perfectly acceptable for the average motorcyclist. However, with the rapid development of technology and the even more rapid development of competition, from its new factories in Birmingham, Norton produced its very first overhead valve engine motorcycle. This, as we can see, is a totally new engine configuration that was something very radical in its day. All the valves are located in the cylinder head, and the camshaft is located in the cylinder block. Lifters and pushrods are there to operate the camshaft, and everything is markedly different from the belt-driven engines of previous models. The Model 18 used the 70mm x 100mm bore and stroke, and had an engine capacity of 490cc, with a top speed of roughly 80 miles per hour. After it had been pre-tested at Brooklands racing circuit, it was immediately used in the famous TT race on the Isle of Man, which it won in 1924. The Model 18 was another Norton that was ideal for the lady rider, because it continued Norton's reputation for reliability, stability, and lightweight frame design. In fact, Norton was one of the few companies that continued a campaign of advertisements for their motorcycles specifically directed towards targeting female riders. Interestingly, this classic Model 18 is cared for today by a lady enthusiast who finds it very stable and easy to handle. She also says it's extremely straightforward to start, despite the fact that it's a 1934 vintage. The initial advertising for Norton had been the unapproachable Norton, as it left its competition in a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes. And when it comes to rallies and ride-outs in the 21st century, it's as valid a statement as it ever was, way back in the mists of time. The adverts for the Model 18 mentioned the famous Norton performance and reliability, which was constantly challenged and proved on the racing circuits. To be perfectly fair, the Model 18 isn't the sleekest and fastest of thoroughbreds, but its look is still aesthetically pleasing despite it being a very basic bike. Smooth and elegant in the lines of design, with a high frame, elongated body and vaguely Art Deco finish to it, the Norton 18 will always be an object of desire for the classic motorcycle collector. Although this was a motorbike made for racing, it was equally at home being used for everyday transport purposes. It also gained a reputation for being the ideal motorbike for a sidecar combination as well, with the extra power of a 4-speed gearbox. The crossover drive that was necessary for the rear chain to avoid the sidecar was now situated on the right-hand side, and this allowed easy maintenance. However, on a sad note, the Model 18 was the last motorbike that had its production and design overseen by James Lansdowne Norton. The blossoming of his company had been a great joy to him, and the continued success of the racing Nortons was a wonderful added bonus. He passed away in 1925, but did live to see the Model 18 break 18 world records at the Brooklands testing track in 1923. James Lansdowne Norton was only 56 years old when he died, but he was affectionately known to friends, relations and workers alike as Pa Norton. Apparently, he had the appearance of a much older man because of his silver hair, wire-rimmed spectacles and haggard face. His health had been failing for some time, and his doctor had advised him to go abroad to see if the sun would liven him up. Typically, he turned this into an opportunity to try out a new model. The long holiday he had in South Africa gave him the opportunity to suggest that the colonial models of his 16H Norton bikes were given higher ground clearance, along with other suitable variations, because of the road conditions in the wilder, uncharted countryside. These were exciting times, and James Lansdowne Norton was one of the truly great innovators in an age when hard work and inspiration took a Birmingham cabinet maker's son to phenomenal industrial success. After the death of Norton's beloved founding father, the factory continued to gain momentum and had little time to mourn his passing. A new and much sportier version of the Model 18 was produced for the 1927 Olympia show in London. This was the premier event in the British motorcycling industry's calendar, and the newly orphaned company wanted to show that it was still alive and kicking. This new model was christened the ES2, which stands for Enclosed Springs. The pushrod and return springs that had been exposed to view on the more pedestrian Model 18 were now totally enclosed. Even though the ES2 used the same overhead valve engine as its predecessor, the drive came off the primary chain, and the ignition device, or magneto as it's more technically called, snugly nestled behind the cylinder. The version of the ES2 that we see here is a 500cc machine made in 1935, a few years after the initial production line run of this sportier Norton for sale. You can see that even though the engine was brought across from the earlier Model 18, the actual frame is now a cradle design with a saddle-type petrol tank and a rounded engine. The owner of this vintage Norton hardly gets a look in when it comes out of the garage, as his partner does most of the riding. She adores the stable handling which the Norton was rightly famous for, and the long, sleek design. Again, Norton seemed to be the bike of choice for the emancipated female riders of a bygone era, and it's a tradition that's evidently being carried on to this day. As you can see, this Norton really does give the appearance of a racing greyhound, with its elongated body and pinned back handlebar ears. At this time, the overhead camshaft engine was becoming a revelation for Norton on the racing circuits. It must be said that everything Norton designed was first produced as a racing bike before it became available to the public. That way it generated more publicity, more fame and more time to fix any problems that might arise in the initial stages. For example, this wonderful motorcycle is a Norton International with a 490cc overhead camshaft engine. This chunkier Norton motorbike was the chrysalis from which a more famous butterfly would emerge, namely the Norton Manx. However, upon their arrival, these Norton International motorcycles were an absolute revelation. They scored win after win around the world, which made the name International seem very aptly chosen. And they didn't only perform well, they also looked absolutely fantastic. You can see the large aerodynamic tank sat in the upper body of the bike like a powerful beating metal heart. These were athletes, muscular, powerful, and packing a real punch. The four-stroke engine was a veritable powerhouse, delivering a very strong bottom end to give the bike that throaty roar. It was actually nicknamed the Tower of Power because of the tallness of the engine, with a highly polished long tube that housed the drive shaft and led to the overhead cam. The top speed was nudging 100 miles per hour. Even with the emergence of the Norton Manx as the #1 racing bike, the International still sold and rode well. Yet it received no further development beyond 1936, which is the year of this particular International. In 1939, the Internationals became a spent force, at the same time that the German army became anything but. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi troops began their attempt to become #1 across the entire globe by crushing all competition, whilst the Norton Internationals gave up their usual powerful #1 position to the new and improved Norton Manx. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the Norton factory at Birmingham was turned over to the war effort as huge orders for the 16H models, the earliest of the Norton bikes to be on show in this programme, meant that all production halted to supply the British Army with what it needed. The cheap and cheerful nature of the 16H model, with the assured road-holding, reliability and Norton quality promise, meant that this was one of the favoured choices for the Army, the Royal Air Force and the Navy, with each one decked out in the appropriate colour to match its military owner. Norton were not alone, because their neighbours, BSA, Triumph and Ariel, all provided military motorcycles, and whatever the make, it was always green for the Army, light blue for the Royal Air Force, and deep blue for the Navy. However, Norton really did keep the production lines rolling during the long and bloody conflict of the Second World War, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, as more than 100,000 16H motorcycles were produced, delivered and used throughout the conflict. World War II united the people of Britain, both on the battlefield and on the home front. The entire nation pulled together for the greater good, as industry mobilised with the precision of an army battalion for the production of arms and resources to equip the fighting forces. There was little doubt that the man behind the gun helped in a significant way to secure victory for the Allied forces in World War II. Men and women working side by side in factories on the home front built weapons, produced food and supplies, and bought war bonds. Many historians believe that war production was the key to the Allied victory, and despite Adolf Hitler's attempts to bomb the factories of Britain, the motorcycle manufacturers of the Midlands kept the military engines running. When the Second World War ended, the Norton Company had many ex-World War II 16H models to sell off. By all accounts, one London dealer had 200 for sale, with an amusing advertising line that read, "Attractively cellulosed in a pleasing shade of green." How successful this proved to be has not been recorded, but in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, a reliable form of transport would have been appreciated by the newly demobbed, whatever colour it happened to be. As things gradually began to get back to normal, Norton restarted production of the ever-popular, ever-reliable Model 18. This was followed a year later by the ES2, and then the Norton International. It was as if a whole shed full of pre-war motorcycles were being revived and given a new lease of life. Had it not been for the war, they would have long since been consigned to the history books. All three of these machines were updated to a higher standard of modified specifications, with plunger frames and the famous road holder forks. Every impression was of a period of all change at the Norton factory in Birmingham, but the simple fact was that Norton had always delivered great motorbikes, which is undoubtedly why they never strayed too far from their initial designs, while still facing a period of uncertainty. If you look back at the 16H, take a glance at the Model 18, shoot a peep at the ES2, and then wink at the International, you'll notice that there are definite similarities between all of these Norton motorcycles. What's more, the design team at Norton knew that Triumph, BSA and Ariel were hot on their tail, metaphorically nibbling at their exhaust pipes. And as Britain grew accustomed to peacetime, a new generation of motorcyclist was ready to take to the road. With so many young men returned from active service to domesticity, there was a real hankering for adventure, and the motorcycle racing circuits and trials events became more popular than ever. Norton responded to the demands of the buying public, and borrowing the best bits from each of their previous bikes, designed a special trials motorcycle called the 500T Competition. This was a streamlined machine, utilising the diamond frame of the 16H with a reduced wheelbase and raked road holder forks. The 490cc engine had been in the Model 18 and the ES2, with a clutch from the ever-popular Norton Manx. It was an amalgamation of everything that Norton did so very well, and far from being a hodgepodge of nuts and bolts, the 500T Competition truly was above and beyond just being a sum of its parts. As you can see, this 1949 Norton 500T Competition is a gorgeous beast, with a distinctive look that appeals to the off-road rider and the more mainstream road rider alike. It is a quick and easy bike that's very light over the ground. In fact, the 500T Competition was tinkered with constantly in its short production life to make it continually lighter. It was much like gently filling it with a little bit of helium instead of petrol every morning. This was a purpose-built bike and tremendously successful. The early examples had a high-level exhaust system, but seeing their mistake straight away, this had soon been swept downwards to be clipped onto the front engine cradle. The oddest thing that happened to the 500T Competition was its sudden demise, because Norton stopped making it very abruptly. Just inside the new decade of the 1950s, this amazingly well-received trials bike suddenly went the same way as the Dodo, vanishing from view to become extinct, and then was talked about as if nobody was really sure if it had ever existed anyway. Norton never produced another trials bike after the 500T, perhaps realising they could never match or better the look, the handling, the power and the reliability of the stunning 500T Competition. As Norton entered the decade of Elvis Presley, blue suede shoes and rock and roll, the biggest change was the design and production of the featherbed frame, which revolutionised their motorbikes. It was designed by the McCandless brothers in Belfast and was so lightweight that it was almost unbelievable. Eventually, the featherbed frame would be made available on all models of Norton motorbikes, and the demand for it certainly justified the development. However, even with success on the racetracks in Europe and the USA, Norton found themselves struggling financially. The threat from Japan was much greater than the one posed when they were enemies of the Allies in the Second World War. Now, in peacetime, they were flooding the British market with technologically advanced machines at very competitive prices, as Yamahas and Suzukis raced around the nation's roads. Norton were unable to fight back, and in 1953 they were swallowed up by the conglomerate called AMC, which stood for Associated Motorcycles Limited. They had already feasted upon AJS and Matchless, and before they eventually went bankrupt in 1966, they'd managed to suck the blood out of Francis Barnett, Enfield, Indian Douglas and Vincent too. Associated Motorcycles Limited were based in London, where they manufactured AJS and Matchless motorbikes in direct competition to Norton. The board at AMC were not really clued up on motorbikes, so speculation had been rife about why they bothered to keep buying up all the famous motorcycling names. Norton continued to produce bikes at their factory in Birmingham, but found it increasingly difficult to turn a profit, as every time they did, it was taken off them by AMC, who were in financial difficulty elsewhere. The public's eagerness to experience the featherbed frame on the Norton motorbikes was effectively the death knell for all the previous designs, but even this very positive reaction caused Norton problems. Reynolds Tubes, who made the featherbed motorbike frame, couldn't keep up with demand, which in turn meant that Norton couldn't supply sufficient motorcycles to sell and make a steady profit. However, in the past, Norton had always risen to a challenge, and they were certainly not yet ready to give up without a fight. The big new model, widely seen as the saviour of Norton, was the Dominator. Even before the events of World War II, the Norton Company thought they were getting left behind after the success of Triumph's twin-cylinder engine and other major manufacturers' advances. So, they poached Triumph's chief engineer, Bert Hopwood, and began to plan for the future as the war ended. Hopwood thought it would be best to get a head start on the rest of the competition, so he steered clear of the design faults on the Triumph and improved the poor cooling, whilst adding a double camshaft for inlet and outlet exhaust valves. The Dominator officially came out before the previous Norton 500T, but it didn't really make any kind of impression to begin with, because it was more expensive than similar machines offered by the other motorcycle companies until 1953. With the added bonus of the featherbed frame, this twin-loop design allowed different types of Norton engines to be fitted. The one we can see here is a rather later model, 1961 in fact, and this is the real big daddy of the Dominator range, known as the Dominator 99. There was a new 596cc parallel twin 4-stroke engine with an alloy cylinder head, higher compression and an AML monoblock carburettor. Both the seat and the petrol tank looked different too because of this new slimline frame. The Daytona camshaft, developed for the racing Manx motorbike, was also fitted on the Dominator 99. And this helped it to a top speed of a bone-breaking 100 miles per hour. The 6,500 revs per minute were matched by the change in power output from 29 to 31 horsepower. The aerodynamics of the motorcycle had also been improved to tie in with the engine's high performance, with only the slightest of adjustments that was difficult to see but easy to feel. Norton's tagline in advertising was "the world's best road holder," and the Dominator hugged the tarmac like an overzealous hippie. In 1962, the Dominator's output was increased to 49 brake horsepower at 6,800 revs per minute, and the 600cc engine was replaced with a long-stroke 646cc motor instead. After gaining a foothold in the lucrative American export market, the Dominator finally had achieved what it set out to do, mixing it up with the big boys, with a style all its own. Consequently, when the engine was bored out for the final time and developed to a teeth-chattering 745cc, it was time to call it a day. The increased price tag to match, along with the increased vibration, was a double whammy for even the most dedicated Dominator riders, and it was a blow from which this wonderful motorcycle never recovered. The 1960s were a time of great change, and there was an unsuccessful attempt by Associated Motorcycles Limited shareholders to oust the group chairman, Donald Heather. It was this chairman's complete lack of understanding of motorcycling that he's best remembered for, and when those that understood the business better challenged him about AMC's lack of investment in new technologies, he was quoted as saying, "Motorcyclists like nothing better than pulling their engines apart on a Sunday afternoon." It was a blinkered view that would eventually cost the British motorcycle industry dear. Nevertheless, Norton sales were going quite well at the start of the 1960s, with the success of the Dominator and similar models ushering in the new era of peace, love and easy riders. But the downside was the fact that AMC began to rely more heavily on the Norton side of their business, with its famous name and reputation to pull in the profit for them. Every time Norton's managing director Bert Hopwood thought he had the green light to move to bigger and better premises, it was always vetoed in the boardroom, with AMC's need to snatch the money away to pay off debts elsewhere. So, Bert Hopwood left Norton in 1961, claiming that he was sick to the back teeth of banging his head against the brick wall of ineptitude and unbusinesslike dealings of the AMC board. The Birmingham factory was shut down, the home of Norton since World War I, and production was moved south to Plumstead in London. Only a few of the 500 Norton employees made the move. Many of Norton's famous models were deleted from their range in a further cost-cutting exercise. AMC, in their usual way of having no idea about what they were handling, decided to rebadge some of their matchless models as Norton motorbikes, like the ES2 Mark II, which didn't go down well with either Norton or matchless enthusiasts. Towards the end of 1966, AMC finally took one last gasp and then collapsed. It was sold to Manganese Bronze Holdings Limited, the parent company of Villiers. This brought about the formation of Norton Villiers that would eventually become Norton Villiers Triumph. A new model was needed to swiftly validate this new operation. Time was of the essence. But a Commando always comes to the rescue, and Norton had a very special Commando waiting in the wings. With just 3 months to go before the 1967 Earl's Court Motorcycle Show, the decision was taken to go ahead with an idea credited to Bernard Hooper. He pioneered something called the isolastic system, which allowed the motorcycle engine to shake like a jelly whilst the rider sat as serenely as a reigning monarch on the throne of England. An existing Norton Atlas 745cc engine was modified to fit a radical new chassis by isolating the angled forward machine from the rider by a means of 3 adjustable rubber mounts, hence the name isolastic, the ingenious coupling of the words isolate and elastic. This was the very first Norton Commando, and it was unveiled at the 1967 Earl's Court Motorcycle Show to a great reception from the riding public and critics alike. In 1973, the 745cc engine was bored out to produce a larger 850 Commando, with a 4-stroke twin engine of 828cc, which is what you can see here. This motorcycle hums with power like a fat bumblebee, and the sporty hump that dominated the rear, like the Sting, earned the machine the nickname of Fastback, giving the motorcycle a distinctive racing line. This was deliberate, as the newly formed company still wanted to trade off the success of the Norton racing team. So it was designed to emulate the model that Peter Williams had ridden to victory in the 1973 Formula 750 TT. Some other points of interest were the triplex primary chain, housed in an alloy casing, and the fiberglass petrol tank and matching tailpipes. The Commando 850 is one of the few British twin-engine machines that could accelerate from 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. If you moved quickly enough through the 4-speed gearbox, you could achieve a jaw-grimacing 120 miles per hour, and probably a speeding ticket from your local policeman. Just before this particular Commando we're looking at was pushed into production, the factory at Plumstead in London had become the subject of a Greater London Council compulsory purchase order. So this necessitated another move, and instead of taking over the Villiers factory in Wolverhampton, the tempting offer of a government subsidy to a development area on a factory estate near Andover was enough to see the whole production line moved there. However, the testing department moved in a different direction to the nearby Thruxton airfield. Part of the manufacturing division did transfer to the Villiers factory in Wolverhampton, which meant that couriers were needed to transfer whole engine gearbox units overnight to complete the Commandos that were on order. The last Commando left Plumstead, the original plant, before the council reclaimed it, and it was a sad day for many, as motorcycle production had been taking place upon that very site for nearly 60 years. As the 1970s, when this particular Commando was produced, stamped on the idealism of the 1960s, the government decided that the financial instability of the BSA Triumph Group was serious enough for them to agree to finance this ailing British industrial giant on one condition. This condition was that the motorcycle division merge with Norton Villiers. So, from the humble beginnings of the Norton Manufacturing Company, it became Norton Motors Limited, then developed into Norton Villiers, before turning into Norton Villiers Triumph, or NVT for short. And sadly, it wouldn't end there. However, among the assets that were acquired during the merger with BSA Triumph was a design for a Wankel rotary engine. Through the next set of financial crises, this inherited rotary engine would be the main project for what was left of Norton. The government withdrew the subsidy that NVT relied upon in 1974, and then the industry minister refused to renew the export credits. To add insult to injury, he also recalled the £4 million loan, which sent the newly formed NVT into temporary receivership, only to be saved by the government again. The company now became NVT Engineering Limited. The Commando motorbikes were still being produced slowly, and the outstanding orders were finished by 1977. By 1978, the Commando had completed its last mission and was honourably laid to rest, but, as this well-preserved specimen confirms, it would never die, despite Norton being in its death throes. The main source of the funds Norton received went towards the development of the rotary engine, with huge financial backing from the government. The Wankel rotary engine was conceived initially by the German firm NSU, way back before the onset of World War II. They held the patent rights for using it in motorcycle applications, and a long drawn-out arrangement was made between the two companies. The first batch of motorbikes, the Interpol II, which used this air-cooled rotary engine, was sold to the police in 1983. However, the success was short-lived until other outlets were found for it, such as the outboard motor for small boats and light aircraft. In 1987, to avoid total liquidation, Norton changed hands yet again and became Norton Group plc. In 1992, a Norton motorcycle won the Isle of Man TT, and the F1 Norton was hailed as the Porsche of the motorcycle world by the major shareholder Philippe Leroux. He left the company in 1991, and the Department of Trade and Industry were called in. It all got very murky and secretive as Norton began to sink under the muddy corporate waters. In 1993, Norton popped up for air as part of a Canadian company. Then the long swim to shore was achieved by yet another merger, this time with March Motors in 1998. In recent years, the company had been rechristened Norton Motorcycles, with a press release that read as follows: "Today, Norton has the consensus support of both the industry and the Norton faithful. The new company is committed to restoring the lustre to the brand and carrying the Norton torch as if the original Norton motorcycles were still in business today." Yet, whatever the future might hold, the classic Norton motorcycles featured in this programme will keep the great company's name alive, well and out on the open road. So, from James Lansdowne Norton's humble beginnings making chains for bicycles, the Norton name has come a long way through history to emerge triumphant at the other end. It has survived the ups and downs of the perennially unstable history of British industry, and every motorcycle enthusiast hopes it will continue to thrill each new generation of motorcyclists in the future. We will never tire of the beauty and the grace of these majestic machines and the sheer power of the Norton engine's mighty roar. The nostalgia of the 16H side valve model that got the company off to such an amazing start. The continued building blocks of the classic and classy Norton Model 18. The ever-popular and always in-demand Norton ES2. The race-worthy style of the Norton International. The purpose-built and incredibly sought-after racing Norton 500T competition. the Norton Dominator 99 with the increased power and continued lightweight easy handling, right through to the very last of the Norton motorcycles to grow from an original concept before the amalgamations became too complicated to fathom. The Norton Commando 850 powers along like an old friend and still echoes the class of the past. A perfect note on which to finish this programme, as this classic British motorcycle quite literally rides off into the distance.